Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Aileen McDonough. I am Director of Content here at G2 Risk Solutions, and I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar on simplifying compliance with Mastercard's new MMP rules. As many of you are already aware, Mastercard has published its revised standards for the Merchant Monitoring Program, and they will take effect on January 1st. In this webinar, we will review the upcoming changes, discuss their implications for payment providers industry-wide, and talk about how G2RS can support you in compliance. It's absolutely crucial for you to consider these requirements as part of your compliance strategies going forward, not only to reduce friction and risk exposure during onboarding, but to strengthen your ongoing relationships with merchants and with the card networks. This disclaimer, I won't read it to you, but this disclaimer is our legal disclaimer that this is not legal advice or professional advice, but simply educational and informational. And you'll receive a copy of this after the webinar. So first, we're going to go through a couple of housekeeping details. This is a pre-recorded webinar, so we will not have a live Q&A at the end. However, our experts have agreed to take time to answer any questions that are submitted. So please, if you do have questions, put them into the GoToWebinar questions panel, and we will contact directly after with the answers. The other thing to remember is that all registrants will receive a link to the recording after the webinar, as well as key takeaways for the G2RS solutions. Now today, I'm very excited to bring to you two leading experts at the forefront of fraud prevention and risk management in the payments and digital commerce space. Sarah Craven is a strong advocate for ongoing education and fraud prevention. She has extensive experience in transaction laundering, risk analytics, and emerging fraud trends and patterns. She is widely recognized for her deep industry expertise and her collaborative approach to addressing threats in the digital payments and acquiring ecosystem. Anna Pogreb is a certified financial crime specialist with expertise in payments, compliance, technology, and digital commerce risk. Her ability to analyze risk is built on a lifetime of diverse experiences, which have given her a knowledge of cultures, languages, and the tactics used by fraudsters. She is an active and influential voice in the fraud fighting community. Now, in a few moments, we'll bring up the pre-recorded webinar.
With Sarah and talk about the changes that are going to be mandatory starting from the basically 1st of January. We're going to go through 3 major changes that were announced, talk a little bit about each of them and what impact it brings to acquirers and to the industry in general. And we'll start with the first one, the expanded expectations on onboarding. So starting from January 1st, for all the merchants that are onboarded on the January 1st or after, the expectation would be that they would be scanned initially before the first transaction is happening. And it's a very important distinction in my eyes. The first transaction, not before they are onboarded, not before they are signed, but before they actually start in processing any money. In my opinion, it brought most probably by risk-based approach that maybe some of the acquirers are taking and reviewing merchants for risks only when they are reaching a certain threshold of the money processed and not when they are passing the first cent or first dollar. And in some cases, this money, they pile up and bring more risk to the network, bring more risk to the people who interact with this merchant. So I think that's the main reason why Mastercard introducing this. What do you think, Sarah?
Well, I think, yeah, it's really important to think about where this initial scan is going to fit into acquirers and payment service providers' workflows, right? From that timing perspective, is this done as part of underwriting, or is it more for maybe for lower risk merchants? Is it right before that first transaction takes place, more of an on-demand scan? And
Oh,
go ahead. Mhm.
yeah, I just thought that if some of the acquirers will try to fit in that initial scan into the pre-auth flow of the first transaction, that actually might hurt the quality of the scan, because the timing is so tight. The amount of milliseconds that is given to assess what is actually needed to be assessed, and as the slide says, right, the scan must include the complete merchant data, everything, all the legal names, all the URLs, all the additional data. It might not be enough time to assess this correctly. So I would recommend performing that scan way before the first transaction happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. Yeah, and in terms of what the scan should cover, it's really focused around, potential violations that could occur with that merchant, with, violating content being sold by that merchant themselves, or detecting any sort of potential laundering activity or risk that that merchant could be connected to or is engaged in actively. So trying to identify that and process that at the time of the first transaction would be a huge challenge.
Also, another thing that Mastercard specifically mentions, right, is that all the URLs need to be scanned. Interestingly, not all merchants probably have URLs, so I wonder what's going to happen with those ones. Will some of them create URLs specifically to submit to acquirers to be scanned? Will acquirers go other way and try to be compliant to this requirement without URLs? Maybe some KYB solutions, compliance scanning, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important to think about the different types of merchants that are going through this flow. And, in the cases where a URL can't be identified through, a tool or process, or if the merchant doesn't provide it themselves, what data can be processed and scanned to determine some of these risks. So some of the things that acquirers and PSPs can think about are things like sanctions list, known bad actors lists. And so when partnering with MMSPs, looking at that historical data set is super important, right? Because if you don't have the URL, using all of those other data points around the merchant to identify potentially risky connections becomes that much more important.
And I would also add that partnering with MMSP who has capabilities to look for the URLs of the merchants if they didn't provide it, there are ways now to determine if merchant actually has a URL and just claims that they don't.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Let's move to the next one.
Great. All right, so another key change in the rules going into effect on the 1st of 2026 is that they explicitly mention the monitoring and requirement of monitoring for URLs with gated content and members only areas. And so there's a couple of challenges that come to mind with this. There's one, even identifying that that merchant has gated or members only areas. And then there is, how do you actually log into the site to do that monitoring? How do you gather those credentials from a merchant? And then how do you do the automated and ongoing monitoring of those merchants in a scalable way and thorough way, right? And so, definitely we're seeing the trend towards requiring more comprehensive monitoring of all types of merchants. But this is definitely a more challenging area than your traditional e-commerce merchant. So Anna, curious of some of your takes on this too.
There is hefty population of merchants that put content that would be actually important for the classification, put it behind the password. And yes, definitely managing that access in a scalable way, because there are multiple solutions, right? We have a solution that will definitely identify if the merchant content is password protected or gated or members only area. We have ways to go behind that password, but will it always mean a human in the loop somewhere? Somebody who would at least, I don't know, gather these credentials, or how much the MMSPs and the acquirers themselves would be able to gather all of these credentials in the automated way, pass these credentials in the automated way. One thing that bothers me always when I'm dealing with fraudulent merchant is how much they can predict. Now they actually gonna know that we are going to try to access that, and when they're sharing their usernames and passwords with acquirers, with whoever needs to get access to that, will they create parts of their websites that would be accessible using those credentials, and showing specific content? Because we've seen this kind of fraud before. We've seen when merchant, when their sites are being accessed, they can, especially if it's a fraudulent merchants and they pay attention to this, they can identify where and who by the URL is being accessed, and they're showing different type of content, more or less benign. And in this particular case, they will know exactly who is accessing their website. Will they try to be to present only the most compliant content in these cases? And it's an interesting problem to have, and I'm sure we will see some of these examples, and I'm sure we will come up with some of the solutions for this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that, acquirers and PSPs are going to have to consider, like those sort of dual processes where it's monitoring the version of the credentials provided by the merchant, but then maybe other processes or solutions that, would act as a real consumer and gain access to that website to see if there's differences in the content that's being presented.
In in the place of acquirer, I think I would also employ some sort of a risk-based approach to how deeply and how much they want to invest into monitoring on different merchants, because obviously one of the main concerns when we're talking about gated content is adult and violative adult specifically. There were too many problems and scandals around it lately. So this is, if there is a risk that the merchant is under the password protected, and they, based maybe on additional information, as you mentioned, based on the merchant history, based on additional documents that acquirer was able to obtain, if there is a risk that they would be processing for adult content, this is where this monitoring becomes crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening, not like at G2 and everywhere right now around agentic AI. And so some of the things that we're looking at is, using agentic AI for credential management, logging into these password protected merchant sites, and doing that monitoring in a more automated fashion, that's actually scalable and probably will still require a human in the loop for that validation and confirmation of findings, but will greatly improve the feasibility of applying this to larger portfolios. All right, should we move on to documentation?
Yes, documentation is very important part, especially when we're talking about compliance. Everything starts and ends with documentation, and Mastercard definitely gave a lot of thought in this update to the documentation, mostly making sure that emphasizing very much that whatever reporting is provided is unaltered and received from MSP and passed on to Mastercard, unaltered, exactly the way that it was produced. That what brought most my attention to this point.
Yeah. And then you want to skip to the next slide? I think this is the perfect. Cool. Yeah, so I think some of the things that we wanted to call out here are around, well, one, the documentation needs to come from a registered MMSP. So that's been specifically stated in the MMP requirements. And as part of that, the history of the merchant being under monitoring with an MMSP is very important, right? You need to be able to show that initial scan and then the full monitoring cycle of that merchant. And so working with a service provider that has that level of historical data and audit trailing is really crucial to be able to fulfill this requirement, and reduces the heavy lifting on the acquirer and PSP side to do that, like tracking and compilation of that audit material.
I would also add that it actually prompts the need to maybe stay with the same MMSP as long as possible, or keep your documentation in a very, very clear order. Because if you move providers, you would, I guess, in case of alert that you would need to justify and show the remediation, you will always have to start as an acquirer, not you as Sarah. You will always have to start with the onboarding scan, which might have happened many years ago, but you still have to provide all the evidence of the first onboarding scan happening whenever it was supposed to happen, and then the persistent monitoring of that merchant and everything that was found, if any alerts were generated, when they were generated, which specific alerts, how they were handled, what resolution was returned to MMSP. We have all of this data, so it's easy for us to provide it. But if other acquirers are looking for other ways to be compliant, it might be problematic.
Right. So those are the main changes that we wanted to talk through today. Obviously, we're happy to answer any follow-up questions and whatnot if you have more detailed questions on the requirements. But we're going to shift into some of the long-term impacts that we see taking place from these requirements going into effect.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think, for me at least, very interesting to think what short-term, mid-term, maybe long-term impacts this particular change are going to bring into the industry. And I think you mentioned it to me when we were talking about it, that we're talking about Mastercard here, but other card brands are not so far behind in these requirements. So I would like to maybe talk about three main impacts that are most interesting for me to watch. The first one is really how the data sharing between acquirers and merchants, acquirers and MMSPs, maybe merchants and MMSPs, depending on how they're gonna approach it, how it's going to happen. Because as we talked about the need to monitor gated and password protected content. So these credentials, they need to be stored by one of the players in the industry. They need to be shared. sometimes in bulk if there are multiple providers, multiple merchants that needs to provide these credentials. So who's going to be responsible for them? How are they going to be passed? In which way, how to create a secure way to pass it, maybe between, again, merchant and acquirer, acquirer and MMSP. What's going to happen in times of data breaches? Who's going to be responsible? These are all the questions that I'm not sure anybody knows the answers to, but these are ones that we will definitely have to look for the answers there. Yeah.
Did you want me to jump into this? Or?
No, I mean,
Okay.
we were talking about passwords mostly, but since the data sharing is going to be, if we're talking about data sharing, in many cases, we were talking about speed of onboarding in the beginning. In many cases, acquirers might ask, might ask a merchant for only the most mandatory and most simple data points in order to get through the onboarding as quickly as possible, because obviously this is what business demands. However, it is changing now, and acquirers will have to ask for more information from merchants, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that we definitely see as the impact is compliance becoming more as an ongoing process, more ever encompassing thing, less, fragmented parts, because obviously reviewing the merchant, I don't know, sanction scanning, scanning for sanctions, email, anti-money laundering, scanning, all of this was always a requirement. However, there's always a notion that it can be done as a separate checks. And in many cases, the results of these checks would be stored even in different places, and somebody might not even see it as one picture, whole picture of the merchant risk. In now, with the way that merchant needs to be persistently and constantly monitored from the moment they onboarded through the whole life cycle, because hopefully the alert will never happen, but nobody knows when exactly it might happen. So acquirers might start looking at the merchant history and the merchant life cycle as the whole ecosystem that needs to be monitored. And even in some cases, looking to see that history of the merchant when they move from provider to provider, because if you want to scan them before the first transaction happened, you might want to know what they were actually doing if they were processing through another acquirer before, right?
Yeah, and I think just to jump in there a little bit too, I mean, I think this really also prompts the conversation of what re-underwriting triggers look like, and what would prompt an acquirer to audit a merchant again and maybe put them through the same checks that were done at the time of onboarding. Because again, we're seeing this trend where there's an increasing emphasis on evidence of these different checks, and making sure that that's on the books for the merchants you have in your portfolios. And so having that conversation around, what is the right cadence for different risk types, I think is going to become increasingly important.
Another impact that I'm thinking about, and I'm interested to see how it's going to play out. I think it's more long-term. That's something that's going to happen right off the bat. But with all this increased request for acquirers to ramp up their technical abilities, we might start seeing shiftings in the portfolios, because if we have higher risk merchants that need to be monitored, some acquirers might just not have a technical capability to do all of these scans and process all of this information in all the time that is required to be done. So they might just start de-risking their portfolios, and the higher risk merchants might move to the bigger acquirers. So there will be, you know, some sort of a consolidation of the merchants in the bigger acquirers who just have technical ability, and they can actually use it as an advertisement point for such merchants, and give them some sort of incentive to come to them, because they would actually be able to work with them in a compliant manner. On the other hand, it could be that these merchants will be migrating to acquirers that would be highly specializing in them. So they would figure out one specific type of a higher risk merchants, one specific industry road, I don't know where they're working, and create their processes in a way that they will be highly beneficial for this specific type of merchants. So we might see maybe some of the higher risk merchants going into specialized acquirers. And it was already happening in the industry, but it might now start happening more. And if we're talking about high risk merchants, specifically, they might just even go off the cards completely, because again, so many things were done in the industry lately. I mean, cards are still the best way to pay, and it's still the preferred way to pay. And no matter how many times there were death to the cards was announced, it still doesn't happen. But still, merchants and buyers from these merchants, they have all these other instruments right now that are also very convenient, that are not cards. So maybe they will start, if we all do our job right, and we're definitely planning to, we might make it very, very hard for them to be processed through cards.
Right, I'll cover off on the last point, which is taking a little bit of a step back and just framing this in terms of the overall trend that we're seeing, not only with Mastercard, but other card brands in terms of increasing compliance requirements. We saw this with VAMP rolling out and changing. We saw this with the VARs requirements that are going into effect. And so we're just in general seeing this increasing oversight trend. And so an interesting thing about the requirements that are going into effect on the 1st is that they mainly apply to customers that are enrolled in MMP, right? And so you might think, well, as an acquirer, I don't know if I'm really set up to adhere to these requirements. Maybe I'm going to opt out of MMP. But there's definitely some short-term and long-term consequences that could be associated with that. Of course, the short-term are, if you're not an MMP, then you're not eligible for any sort of fine mitigation. Whereas if you're working with a registered MMSP and follow these requirements, then you are eligible for that mitigation. Longer term impacts could be, potentially increased scrutiny by the card networks in terms of, a consistent trend of non-adherence with some of these requirements that could lead to potentially higher fines. And so these are all things to keep in mind where, weighing the risks of how to proceed. And generally, we're, again, just seeing an increasing trend towards requirements and oversight. And so to stay ahead, it's really important to start having these conversations, revamping internal processes, and working closely with your MMSPs to make sure that everything's covered.
So talking about MMSPs, let's maybe talk a little bit about our risk solution and how we specifically can help with this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so when we sort of frame this at G2RS. We're really thinking about risk of the merchant through the entire merchant lifecycle. This kind of calls back to the points we were making on the last couple of slides of, compliance being an ongoing effort, not just a one-time scan here or there, and also some of the considerations around re-underwriting and the processes or triggers that feed into those workflows. So we sort of have the merchant life cycle where, the merchant is applying for an account, they go through that onboarding process, and then there are a number of monitoring activities that should be taking place for that merchant throughout their existence, right? And then there could be certain triggers, audits, periodic reviews that would trigger that re-underwriting workflow to occur. So we just wanted to sort of frame this because all of our solutions fit into this paradigm. And I think it's a powerful way for an acquirer to map certain parts of their workflow into these different buckets and understand how it all ties together for a full risk picture of a merchant.
In general, you have to have all of these different solutions at all of these different times of the merchant life cycle to make sure this alert never happens. But if it happens, unfortunately, we do have solutions that help them to provide the documentation and be compliant to that as well.
Yep, absolutely.
So I guess wrapping up, as we said, we are here to help you to maintain compliance with, as usual, with the monitoring of your merchants, but even with the new enhanced expectations as well. And we are doing it in a way that should not disrupt your business, because protecting customers and protecting yourselves from fraud is very important, but obviously the most important thing is to keep the business going, and this is where we also come in, not to disrupt your operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're happy to, of course, go into more detail if there's follow-up questions of how we can support your business in terms of meeting the new requirements. We do, of course, offer password protected monitoring, ongoing monitoring, initial onboarding scans, and all of that good stuff. So we're happy to dive into any of our solutions more for those who would like to learn more.
Merchant history, we look into this, and looking for the URLs. If the merchant hasn't provided them, we are able to do that as well. And since some of the requirements are talking not just about brand violations, but transaction laundering as well. This is a very important topic for all the card brands, and Mastercard speaks about it also explicitly in these new requirements. We have solutions to help monitor for transaction laundering as well.
All right. I think that wraps up what we were going to cover today. Again, if there are follow-up questions, we will do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. And we thank you for joining.
That concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, this recording and these takeaways will be in your inbox in a few days. So thank you for registering so that you can obtain them. We invite you to follow us on LinkedIn and check out our website if you have any questions, but we remain a trusted compliance partner, uniquely equipped to help you meet the evolving needs of this industry. Thank you so much.